So we're excited to be here in Rockville, Bethesda, and we're looking forward to going back to San Diego, possibly next year. But at the same time, this is and Shay, you really hit the nail on the head in terms of the innovation. You can't have pricing without having some innovation and some key thoughts along that line. So it brings us to where we are now as far as the event. I welcome you back to our first panel. This is our first panel discussion. It's a federal acquisition panel looking at pricing and innovation. And it's my esteemed pleasure to bring the moderator to the stage, and he in turn will introduce the other participants. We have a participant from the from the Department of Homeland Security. We also have NASA, we have Army, and we have Air Force. So we're looking forward to that conversation. So let me talk a little bit. So Dr. Schooner, Dr. Schooner is a Nash and Sabinic Professor of Government Procurement Law and co-director of the Government Procurement Law Program at George Washington University. So prior to joining the faculty there, he was the Associate Administrator for the Procurement Law and Legislation at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy. During his illustrious career as well, he's held various attorney positions at Department of Justice, Armed Services Board of Contract Appeals, and private industry. He has a global presence, and Steve, I didn't know this. So you have provided guidance to senior leaders around the world, 30 countries around the world, and I think you just got back from a trip as well here recently. Steve is highly recognized through the National Contract Management Association, where he is an NCMA fellow and also a certified professional contract manager, a CPCM. And he's also the recipient of the prestigious award, the Charles A. Dana Distinguished Service Award. He's a faculty member for the American Bar Association as well. So, Steve, we are just plumb excited to have you here as a part of the panel. And we'll just go ahead and have all of the other panelists come up. Let's give the panel and Dr. Schooner a round of applause. And we're looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.
So while everyone else is getting seated, I'll just remind you that on the electronic webpage, you have full bios, but just as I move down the line, it's wonderful to be here this morning. I'm pleased to be able to participate in this panel. I'm particularly pleased to be able to moderate a panel of federal executives of this quality, knowledge, experience, and impact. So just very, very briefly, Soraya Correa is the Department of Homeland Security's Chief Procurement Officer and has been in that role since January of 2015. Going down the row, Bill Roets is currently the Director of Contract Grant Policy Division at NASA Headquarters, Office of Procurement. Previously, he served at the National Reconnaissance Office, which is one of those unique entities that straddles space and the defense community. Then next to him, Stuart Hazlett is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Procurement, been in that role since 2017, and previously had a role as the Director of Contracting for the Army Corps of Engineers. And all the way down at the end, Janice Muskopf is the Chief of the Pricing Division, the Directorate of Contracting for the Headquarters Air Force Materiel Command, coming in from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The one thing I'd like to mention, if you haven't really looked at the bios yet, I'm always pleased to see people like Janice who came into the acquisition field through one of the agency internship programs. So it's nice to see that the internship programs are able to develop this kind of talent and that people stick with it and go on to do great things. In a moment, I'm going to literally turn it over to our panelists who have much to say, but I can't have had the opportunity to come here, get lost on the way and everything else, and not open with a few thoughts and comments. And it's particularly interesting to open a panel like this following a luminary like Sheh Assad. It's wonderful to see the morning begin with Shea being recognized with such a prestigious award, and I applaud Shea for his long and committed service. If nothing else, I've always been impressed by Shea's staying power, and let's be unequivocally clear, in the world that we live in today, continuity matters. Another thing, and again, maybe in contrast to myself, I've always appreciated Shea's calm demeanor, that seemingly even keel, the genteel discussion of complicated issues. And I like the fact that when I listen to him, what he says makes sense, but often it still leaves me scratching my head. So I just want to mention a few things that our panelists may or may not want to comment on later that they may address based on Shea's comments. So first, I was ecstatic to hear that Shea said that they're working with DAU, thinking about the team project, and trying to increasingly share best practices and share techniques. But there's part of me that wants to hear a little bit more about what the policies are that are being promoted. I sense from the private sector that many fear that contracting officers are taught that the coin of the realm is reducing prices and limiting profit. I don't believe that's what the FAR says. I don't believe it's actually the government's policy, but I fear too many people hear that message. I also tend to worry that at DAU, too many of our junior people aren't really taught about the power and the importance and the meaningfulness of incentives and disincentives. And I love the anecdote that Shea used. Shea brought up the tanker. And he made a very good point that by the time we were down to 2 vendors, we knew exactly that both of those vendors were capable of building a competent tanker. And so to some extent, it became a price shootout. But the interesting thing is, what Shea didn't talk about is the fact that there was an option that is perfectly acceptable under the DoD 5000 series, and in fact is encouraged, and that's the use of competitive prototypes. And as we evolve over time from a focus on low price to maybe thinking more creatively about life cycle cost, I guess my aspiration in the future is that we someday might structure a procurement like that a little bit differently, where we give those 2 qualified vendors maybe $1 billion each, and we say, you bring me your best tanker on this date. And I'm going to fly him around the world for about a year, and I'm going to keep track of how much gas you use and what my maintenance costs are. And then I'm going to do customer satisfaction surveys of the pilots who have to stick their nose of their planes into that droge, the people who had to maintain those aircrafts. And then I'm going to do a quality factor based on my actual expenditure to predict my actual life cycle cost for the total usage of these aircraft over 30, 40, or 50 years. That's the paradigm shift we haven't made, and that's what TINA is never going to fix for us. Similarly, and I hope the panelists will weigh in on this also, I think we do need to think more creatively about how we pay and price services. Shea said that in the private sector, and he's mostly right, that the private sector doesn't want to overpay for services. But I do not believe that the private sector buys anything with regard to services based on low price alone. I'm in the process right now of dealing with an elderly parent going into elder care services. I can tell you that price is not my only consideration. It's also not the way that the government thinks or operates. It's not the way that we would hire a surgeon. It's not the way we would hire child care. It's not the way we choose our auto care servicers or the people who maintain our heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, or even fix our roofs. I believe we are much more interested in past performance when we hire services because all we care about are outcomes, and we are not as price sensitive as we think. So price does matter, but it's not the only consideration. I'll give you one anecdote from the news this week. The Capitals finally won the Stanley Cup.
Yeah.
Yep.
And 2 weeks later, the coach is gone, proving unequivocally that price does matter. The Caps knew exactly what the market price for Barry Trotz was. He is the 5th most winning coach in the history of the NHL. They knew what the only people ahead of him were making, and they did not want to pay that price for a long period of time. But I can assure you they will not hire the cheapest coach available, because there are innumerable talented Division I college coaches that would do the job for $100,000 a year. They're not going to do that. They're not even going to think along those lines. I also want to say a little word about LPTA, because I expect that'll come up as well today. I agree with Shay that it is true that we have seen a reduction in DoD contracts where the solicitation says at the top, this is LPTA and only price matters. And it is true that price is a dominant factor. But in practice, it is still too common for us to disproportionately favor price over quality, durability, customer satisfaction, and speed, all of which ties into incentives and disincentives, which is a huge issue with regard to pricing. But I guess the biggest concern I had from listening to Shay's discussion this morning, and again, to some extent, I understand he's preaching to the choir in this room, but he ignores the elephant in the room. I agree with Shay that the goal of pricing is to get reliable results. And I love that he asks the question, what are we trying to do with the cost or pricing data? We're trying to come up with an accurate estimate, and we're trying to figure out a reasonable and fair profit for the work. But let me also be unequivocally clear, in the legal community and in the compliance community, when they hear pricing, they're talking about risk. They're worried about being prosecuted for fraud. And I am a little bit concerned that DCAA and the Department of Justice aren't sitting in conferences like this internalizing that the actual policy here is customer satisfaction, quality outcomes, speed of prototype development, and delivering goods and services to the warfighters. As a former Department of Justice attorney, let me be unequivocally clear that at the annual Civil Division Award ceremony every year, there are special awards given to attorneys that have multi-million-dollar fraud recoveries. Nobody asked them if the warfighters got the products that led to the fraud prosecutions. The coin of the realm is fraud prosecution. And so the concern is that this stuff is complicated. In any event, a little bit of food for thought. What I'd now like to turn is to each of the panelists and have them offer some thoughts about some things we should be thinking about today. Soraya.
Okay, all right. Well, he gave us a lot of food for thought, so I'm going to see if I can nail it all in my intro, and then I can go off and have breakfast. Just kidding. First of all, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be here at the conference to have a conversation with you and to be with this distinguished panel. I would like to introduce a member of my intern program from the Acquisition Professionals Career Program. Elisa Cervantes is joining me today. I always invite APCPs to shadow me so that they get the experience of what leadership is about and how these conferences work, because they otherwise are sometimes stuck in an office all day and don't get to see this. So a couple of things that I wanted to highlight. So I'm here as the Chief Procurement Officer of the Department of Homeland Security, and I do employ the services of cost and price analysts and contracting specialists who specialize in looking at pricing solutions for what we buy. We buy a lot of commercial products and services, but we also take those products and services and craft them, prototype them, if you will, into longer or more complex solutions to support our first responders. So I come at this from a slightly different perspective of the DoD. But I will tell you this, that it is my philosophy that it is not about low price. I, in fact, hate when people talk to me about the lowest price. That's okay when you're buying pens and pencils. But if you are buying products and services to support the mission of the agency, to support those first responders, then it better be about the best possible solution at the right price. And that is the emphasis that I place on pricing. We should be paying the right prices, the correct prices, the best prices. Not necessarily is that the lowest price. And I think it is important that we understand what we're buying, we understand the industry from which we're buying, and that we engage early and often with the integrated product team, including the users of the products or services you're trying to buy, the cost and pricing analysts, your contracting officers, your legal counsels, and anybody else who wants to come to the party and have an opinion. Get them at the table as early as possible so that they can understand the approach that you're trying to take, what you're trying to buy, and how you're going to try to buy it. And I would also add that that does include getting out to industry. Getting out as early as possible when you have your first inclination that you're going to have a requirement to try to understand what they're thinking about. Because all too often in the government, we become a little bit arrogant and we pretend that we know more about the pricing strategies of industry than industry does. In reality, we can learn a lot from industry about how they're going to price a solution, what are the things that really motivate them, inspire them, if you will, to offer pricing discounts so that we can build that into our solutions. So some of the things that I've done to push this forward is I do encourage the engagement with industry, but I encourage the engagement even before we have a solicitation. We've done some things at the Department of Homeland Security that are a little unique. We call them reverse industry days, where we invite industry to talk to us. We are their audience, and they come through the industry associations and tell us about the things that they're thinking about when they look at our solicitations. What motivates them to compete for a procurement? What motivates them to bid on something? And what are the things that they look at when they're taking into consideration whether or not they're going to participate in the procurement? The other thing that we have are acquisition innovation roundtables. And this is where we pick subject matters that we talk to industry about what we could do better. So last year we hosted one on effective pricing strategies in a changing world to talk about what are some of the new techniques in pricing. How is industry looking at LPTA and best value, and what do they think about when they're trying to price that? And what can we do in our solicitations? How do we present information to them to entice them to give us their best prices, to give us their best solutions, and to better inform us of what's behind the prices? So those are some of the things that we're doing from that side of the house. The other thing that I emphasize, we got to train our COs and our contract specialists, our contracting officers, and our contract specialists to be better negotiators. I think that somewhere in the mid-90s to the early 2000s, we've become a little bit more, I'm going to use the term conservative. The real term is risk-averse. And so I think COs are a little more hesitant to, in some cases, to slam their fist on the table and ask for a really good price and ask hard questions and really negotiate. This is about cutting a deal. It is about negotiating the best price. And the best negotiators are the ones that are very well trained and very well informed in the commodities that they're buying. So one of the things that we're trying to push very hard is the training. Simplify the training, not the 1 week long course, but really focus on the elements of pricing. We buy a lot of services, so what should we be considering when we're thinking about services? What are the things that we should be saying in our solicitations? So that's the area that I'm emphasizing. In fact, when I walked into my job, the first thing I asked for was a really good negotiations class from my Homeland Security Acquisition Institute. And then last but not least, I do want to emphasize innovation. I believe that just because we did it one way before and it worked is not necessarily the way we need to do it now. We need to be innovative, we need to be creative, and we need to invite innovation and creativity from industry. And so we need to define what that means to us, define what that's going to mean to industry, and define how you are going to evaluate innovation and creativity. So those are some of the things that I'm emphasizing. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Bill.
And before we go to Bill, just a couple of things. As I'm sure everybody realized at this point, we're still taking questions. We have a few left over from earlier, but I think we all just got a very interesting reminder about something that we should all know. Somebody said, could you please remind everyone in the audience what the acronym LPTA stands for?
Low price.
It's kind of interesting that so many of us have internalized this. LPTA, lowest price technically acceptable. And what we're talking about is not sealed bidding where we have a public opening and it's low price wins, but we structure some kind of what we think of a negotiated procurement or competitive proposals where we're basically doing, in effect, a pre-qualification saying, you're good enough, now we're going to determine, since you are technically qualified, who of the remaining players can offer us the lowest price. So LPTA is an approved strategy under FAR Part 15. And just going back to the point that I was making earlier, one of the concerns is that sometimes it is used without the moniker but is still the same thing in effect. I guess the last thing I'd add on that, to the extent that people may not be as familiar with it as many of us tend to assume, is that there was basically a bit of a whiplash effect, because early in the DoD Better Buying Power initiative, there was a pretty aggressive push towards LPTA and then a rather swift retraction from that, and it's been unclear whether that message has been fully embraced. Against that background, though, over to you, Bill.
All right. Hey, thanks, Steve. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here to kind of share to you what NASA is doing in the way of contract cost price analysis and the different initiatives and challenges that we're facing in trying to improve that skill set throughout NASA and all. And so we've been working on this for several years and been working on different things that I'll kind of share with you, some of the things that we've been working on and what have been working out. But we kind of see right now the biggest challenge that we're facing with contract cost price analysis is how to efficiently utilize that limited resource. We have a very limited resource of cost price analysts in that within the agency, and we want to be sure that we utilize them fully so we can share that across all of our NASA centers and that to have their expertise brought to bear on our high risk and complex negotiations that we have in acquisitions in that. So that's what we're trying to struggle with now, is that how to best utilize that resource and to efficiently utilize that resource. So we've embarked off on a couple of initiatives in that regards in that. We formed up and kind of got that whole group together, and now we have a pricing community of practice. That pricing community of practice is a vigorous group that meets on a monthly basis. And they are looking at innovations in pricing, things to improve in that area, and things that we can do in that regards. We've also set up for them is that they have a community of practice website. It's a collaboration site more than anything. It's that where they can collaborate, ask questions if that come up. And the rest of the workforce, all of our contracting officers and that as well, can reach back to this community. Now there's a set community with their own web page, a collaboration area. They can ask questions, and it's just a group that they can get back to and touch back, as they're working their issues in that when it comes to cost and pricing. The other thing is that we did is that we are scattered across. We're 10 centers across the nation, and that makes up NASA. We have buying commands in each one of those, and that we have cost price analysis in each one of those. And so we said, well, how can we best utilize this resource in that? We tend to be, the price analyst is working over at this center, and then they really didn't, talk too much with the price analyst over at the other center. We're trying to bring that together in that. But the one thing we wanted to do to efficiently utilize that resource is we created this sharing model. How do we share these resources across the centers in that? And so we've kind of come up with a robust way to do that, is that we have at the beginning of each year, we kind of gather up, and we know is that what procurements are on the horizon in that. We kind of hear that from each of the centers. The centers come in and they tell us that, well, here's what we have coming up. And we think is that, we have a lot of actions here that's too much for the cost price analysis in this area that we have. And we share across the centers. And so that is brokered between all the center procurement officers and myself, is that we take a look at that and we make sure that we can plug and play and get the right cost price analyst over there to help out those situations. And then we reevaluate that at a 6-month point. All right, does something new come up on the horizon? Do we have to adjust that in that? So just trying to find a more efficient ways to utilize those resources across the board. We're also doing the training. I know that Soraya mentioned the training, is that we're trying to train up all of our contracting officers on cost price analysis, because I have a limited resources, a limited amount of contract cost price analysts, and therefore I can't utilize them on everything. I got to utilize them on our high risk, complex, sole source negotiations. That's where I need them to be working. And so we have to train up the rest of the contracting workforce so they can handle the cost and pricing areas on the other acquisitions in that. So we're aggressively pursuing that, getting them trained up to make sure that they're able to do that, so we can kind of complement the two. They can always reach back to the cost price analysis, but they have the expertise to do that themselves. The last thing I mentioned is that we have several initiatives going on, is that we instituted and has been very successful is peer reviews, but it's not the peer reviews that you kind of hear a lot of times. We kind of took a look at that and said, before when we instituted peer reviews, it was always kind of like on the backside. They would sit there and look at the products after they've gone through like the cost evaluation, and they're at the very end and looking at what they've produced already, and then commenting back and said, oh, you should have done this, or maybe you should have done that. We thought, well, that's not really efficient. We want to try something different. And so we set up these cost price analysis peer review teams for some of our high-risk, complex acquisitions to where they come in at 3 points during that acquisition. They come in up front at the solicitation development. They take a look and see is that what is the way are we asking for in the way of cost and pricing data? Are we asking for the right things? What is our cost evaluation strategy going to be? We have to think ahead of time, what are we going to do? Are we going to utilize audit support? Are we going to reach into the DCMA and get support there? How are we going to evaluate subcontracts? How are we going to do things? They got to set up a plan up front, and that's part of the solicitation, so we can ask for the right cost data, based upon what we think we're going to need. So the peer review team helps them out there. And then once they get the proposal and they get into the evaluation, the peer review team is another check-in at that point. They check in and say, how's things going? We had this great plan. How's it going? Is it we following the plan or not? Is it got some surprises? Do you have any roadblocks you hit? If you hit some roadblocks, let us know what those are. We see if we can help you out and re-vector so we can keep on a good, efficient cost evaluation. Then, of course, at the end, they take a look at the pre-negotiation position and take a look across that and make sure that, that we did what we said we were going to do, and it's a sound cost evaluation so we have a strong objective position. So we've implemented that, and it's been very successful. Is that I believe it's improved our negotiations. We go in there with a much better negotiation positions and in a much better position to negotiate with the contractors from a factual base. So those are just some of the things that we're doing in that. Love to talk with everybody about that. If you have questions about those things, fire them up here. If you're a little shy and don't want to fire them up this way, we can always meet you afterwards. So over to you, Stuart.
I don't know what's more intimidating, following Mr. Assad or having an attorney as your moderator.
And you can say it, an obnoxious attorney.
And I want to thank everybody, all the sponsors that brought us together for this summit, because this is very important to have the dialogue that we're having here today. But I guess I'll just take the opportunity, talk about Army Strong. We have 8,000 contracting professionals out there that are working in the trenches as we speak. We've already obligated about 40, I think this morning when I looked, $54 billion this year, and I have another $44 billion to be obligated. And I might look calm now, maybe I don't, but underneath I'm in a panic because I got to obligate $44 billion by the end of September with about 80-some thousand actions. And if I look across those, what they tell me is you can expect to see about 68 J&As coming to you between now and the end of September for contracts that need to be awarded by the end of September. And I'm thinking about all that hard work that needs to take place for us to get to a fair and reasonable price. So that brings me back to a couple of the initiatives that we're trying to do to keep our heads above water, right? And to do the right thing. The Secretary of the Army and the Chief of Staff of the Army has set out where my direction is readiness, modernization, and reform. And we can talk about reform and all the different ways of where I'm trying to contribute to the readiness and modernization of the Army. And I know that as we talked about the different contract types and source selection procedures and how we're getting there, but what it comes down to me, is the number one thing, that if you peel back any of these challenges, it comes back to people. A professional that's standing there that needs help, that needs guidance. And I applaud Mr. Assad and congratulate him on his award, because one of the things that we've done in the Department of Defense over the last 10 years is to bring ourselves together as military departments in the Fourth Estate with DLA, DCMA, and our other agencies, is to say, what lessons do we have learned? We're all working with the same contractors at the high end. We're working with many of the small business contractors at a lower end. And we realized that what position my battle buddy over here, Janice, might be doing with Raytheon and the Air Force, what position do I have when I'm dealing with on the Patriot missile? There may be cost data that she has that I can leverage, that I can use, that will help me get there quicker on my end. And so what I ask industry to do, if you're out there representing your companies, is also to share lessons learned. talk amongst yourselves too, because we used to think the common denominator was you knew more about what the Air Force, the Army, NASA, or DHS was doing than what we knew. I don't think that's the case any longer. We've worked very hard to make sure that we communicate and that we know through DCMA and DCAA, they're our battle buddies. They're our partners. We work well with them, and we depend on them. And one of the things I think about when I think cost and pricing, I think of three things. I think contract type, I think cost actuals, and I think tailoring. Because if I can get the right contract type, which I know that we're still struggling with, should we use it? And I think that we've come a long way when we look at the percentiles of saying, if we're there within our actual costs in the past, if we understand the realized profit, if we know where we were within a couple of percent, then we're firm fixed pricing it. We're good to go. That is the best contract type out there that gives you the freedom to deliver on cost schedule performance for us. But if we start getting outside those few percentile, as Mr. Assad mentioned, we got to start looking at another contract type. I think we've been so quick in the past to run right over into a cost reimbursement environment. And we're trying to bring that back and say, well, there are other types. Fixed price incentive firm target. And there is so much out there. I was talking to somebody earlier that you can go out on Google and you can learn all kinds of things. One of the things you can't learn on Google is how to do a fixed price incentive firm target equation. Because there's all kinds of information out there. We bring it back and we say, all right, let's not make this complicated. Let's not make it difficult. There's different ways of doing it, but it doesn't have to be that hard. I know that we spend an inordinate amount of time talking to industry so that you understand what does it mean to have a fixed price incentive firm target equation. Commercial industry normally doesn't use an arrangement like that. There's other types of business arrangements you may enter in with each other. So we're doing an awful lot on training. When we talked about what kind of training are we doing, I target fixed price incentive firm targets. I want to educate. I want to whet the appetite. I want to make them want to go learn more. Go to the university with DAU, with Jim Woolsey, and learn more in depth if they've got it. But what we cannot do is set up a structure of a business arrangement such as a fixed price incentive firm target and then walk away. I'm very concerned about the contract administration. I'm worried around the back end. We may get a great deal that's equal to both of us. You got a great deal, I got a great deal, we're there. And then in the contract administration of it, all of a sudden things start happening. We start modifying the contract. We start taking away scope. We start doing things. And before we know it, we're either putting you in a very bad position as a contractor, or we're putting the government in a very bad position to get mission support. So we have to keep looking at FPIF and where does that fall in the best value continuum as we look at risk. I'm also looking at OTAs. When I said that Army is focused on readiness and modernization, we're not getting a lot of money to buy that next generation weapon system. So we're taking a lot of our own old chassis and we're going in and we're saying, help us. You're hearing terms like NDC, non-traditional defense contractors. I'm watching language in Congress that would almost say, well, if you've been a small business and you haven't had CAS in a year, you're a non-traditional defense contractor. The aperture card opens up. Well, we also have to give consideration when we're entering another transaction agreement with you, possibly with a prototype to help us with our modernization effort. What's the price? Are we doing that fairly? Because what the last thing we don't want is our use of OTAs that go down the path of a misunderstanding, such as low price technically acceptable, a source selection procedure. I wish we would just rename LPTA to something like TALR or something, right? Technically acceptable, lowest reasonable price, or so. The title, the acronym, I think we ought to just throw it out of our lexicon. We'll start over. We know what we're doing. We know that we can come up with a source selection procedure, because at the end of the day, what we're really doing is subjective trade-offs. We're doing VATEPs, the value adjusted total evaluated price. Really, with those two and the hybrids that we do, we'll get there. And I think we'll get there with the best value contractor, that we have. So OTAs are a focus of our training vignettes. We're doing that. And we're also coming back on talent management. And talent management is, to me, is meaningless unless you have somebody's name tied to it. Unless I have a young pricer like Becky Snyder, who's here today from ACC Redstone, putting a name and saying, where do you want to go with your career? How do we grow and mature you to become the leader of the future that the Army needs, that the Department of Defense needs, if you choose to go Air Force or possibly Navy or somewhere else? So we're doing little vignette videos to help them, to let them know what else is out there, not just in the Army, but what other opportunities are out there, and how can they, when they set up their aspirations, how can we help them achieve those aspirations? We look at data analytics. A lot of the times that we're having to make decisions, and I only talk about the Army, we're doing it on a lot of things except facts. We have no business system. I take this opportunity to say, if you're out there, please support us in the Army having a business system, having a new Army contract writing system. I'm using legacy systems that came out in SBS in 1999. We've done some upgrades, we've done some things, but I cannot go in there and turn data that I need in facts to make intelligent decisions. When people say, well, are we using too many LPTAs versus trade-offs? If I had a business system, I'd tell you. Right now, I manually can tell you I'm only doing it 15% of the time. Out of 270,000 actions are on the LPTA. But how much labor did I have to do to get that answer? I should be able to get it very fast. And you in industry need that information too, because you are worried, you're concerned. Well, are we trending in the right direction? Are we doing fixed price versus cost? And where in the cycle of possibly a weapon system are you trading off in the different contract types? And what are you doing? So we need business systems. We're underway in the Army. We hope to deploy for a pilot next year even, a Army contract writing system to one of our commands, and we hope to go from there. The contract of services, and I know we've mentioned that, it is a very big focus in the Army right now. We have reform management groups where I lead a group on the contract of services. And how are we acquiring our services in support of our troops? We have gone at it where it all comes back to how do we shape the requirements and where are the requirements coming from? I can be at an installation and anybody shows up with money and a request and all of a sudden they have a requirement. We do not have a centralized control, and I think that is where we're looking for in the Army, is to go to more of a category management approach to a lot of the types of services we're buying. I go back to the low price, technically acceptable. What I'm seeing, we're not using it on major weapon systems. Our formal source selections over $100 million, we're doing trade-offs. We don't have that much money. But what we want is quality for that. And when we can, and we put extra money down on something, we want to know what we're getting. But when it's under that $100 million, down at the smaller level that we're talking about, above $1 million or so, I'm seeing LPTAs being used when we're acquiring services. Is because when they look at our guides, they take it and they say, it says, if it's a commercial or if it's a non-complex, and I don't need to apply, I'm going to do a low price, technically acceptable. And I think that's where it's gotten away from us. And we're bringing that back in because there's an awful lot I may want to trade off to acquire a service. So I'm taking a hard look at that with those 8,000 professionals. But when it comes to cost and pricers in the Army, I got 8,000 of them. Everybody's accountable. Everybody's responsible to deliver a fair and reasonable price, but we need to look at our cycle times. We have to know that we can support a soldier who needs that capability in their hands. And the last thing a soldier needs to hear when they're standing out in the middle of chaotic environment is to say, when they call in and they don't have a mission-capable helicopter to come take them out, and why. And if you go all the way back that supply chain and you find out that I have a contracting professional somewhere who cannot reach a fair and reasonable agreement, I hold the contractor accountable and I hold us accountable. Joint culpability, as into have we forgotten why we need to move on, and we can't have these cycle times out there a year and a half, or 2 years. We got to get our source selections back down into a framework of 6 to 9 months. We've got to get our sole source negotiations down to that 120 days. We need to do this for the troops. So with your help, I hope that we can get there. Thank you.
All right, Janice.
Okay, so I'll try to make this fairly quick so we can answer some questions from the audience. For those of you who don't know me, I have a little bit of a rebellious streak in me, and that's why I'm sitting up here today. Mr. Assad's smiling. You can't see that, but he is. And back in the 90s, when pricing was not cool, that's what I was doing. So I was doing pricing long before Sheh Assad came in and started talking about pricing. I have literally dedicated my career to this business. And in the times when everybody was supposed to be a generalist, I just wanted to do pricing. So I found ways to stay in pricing and do a variety of things, like get a warrant for defective pricing, do source selection, go into FM as a cost analyst so I could continue doing what was related to pricing. So I share that with you because I am a die-hard pricer. And I want you to hear my perspective when it comes to things like LPTA and is there a war on profit. So as a die-hard pricer, I would not say that I'm going around advocating LPTA, because in the Air Force, we want planes that fly. That's pretty important to us, right? Yeah. And when it comes to the idea of a war on profit, there's no war on profit. We have a war on cost. And I want industry to be in the same war with us when it comes to cost and becoming more efficient. And so when we talk about, this little rule of thumb as far as the actuals, and you look at, let's say we negotiated 12% and the company realized maybe 30 or 40% profit. So is it a war on profit when you go back and look at what happened? Was it, magically on the 10th production lot, they became more, that much more efficient? Typically, that's not going to be the answer, because it's pretty hard to move that dial, right? Especially in a mature environment. So we're looking at, what was the estimating? How good did that look? And what kind of job did we do evaluating the estimating? And if it turns out that it had that kind of swing, then we probably need to look at a different contract type. So it's definitely not a war on profit, it's a war on cost. And we want to bring costs down. And we want to share in terms of the cost underruns. And we're obviously willing to share in cost overruns when it comes to FPIF contracts. So as the leader of the Air Force pricing community, I meet with our folks about once a month. And some of the things that we're focusing on are sharing our stories in terms of how we're doing things more efficiently. And we're a major piece of this. I am very much aware of the fact that when it comes to the acquisition, that pricing is usually at the tail end of the process, and the only people that have it worse than we are when it comes to you're not going fast enough are probably the DCAA auditors. So we're spending a lot of time talking about what are we doing more efficiently, and then tomorrow I've got the opportunity to kind of give you a glimpse into the sole source streamlining toolbox, which is something I've been very focused on because we are getting results from that. One of the areas that I'm pretty concerned about right now is subcontracts, and I believe Mr. Assad mentioned it a little bit earlier. When we look at about 70%, a lot of times of our major weapon systems being subcontracted out, that's an area we need to collaborate on. And so one of the things that I've been focusing the last few years, I have found that our problems in the Air Force are definitely not unique to us. Everybody has the same concerns. And so I've been focusing a lot on collaboration. And I was pleased to be invited today because I want to expand my collaboration to industry. And I think we've already started that with the sole source streamlining toolbox and the companies that we're working with in terms of piloting the techniques in there. So with that, I will kick it back to you so we can start answering questions.
So before we turn to questions, just a few observations on some of the excellent points made by our panelists. First, in light of our first question for the morning, to the extent that we've already been challenged on acronym bingo, OTAs are Other Transactions Authority. And if you haven't been following OTAs, Congress is much more interested in them as of the last couple of years. And what the OTAs are all about is flexibility and doing other than all of the rule and constraint-based procedures that we're normally doing. OTAs tend to generate speed and flexibility, and what they tend to not do a very good job of is anticipating problems in the long run or coming up with rubrics for how to deal with them later. So you might say it's a wonderful way to get started quickly and kick the difficult issues down the street. I want to focus on one of the excellent points that Janice made, that learning from experience and sharing experiences from looking back retrospectively at contracts is not a war on profit. I could distinguish that from, for the older folks in the room, there used to be something called a renegotiation board, where Congress set up a rubric where we actually used to try to negotiate and take back excessive profits, sometimes as low as 3 and 4%. But the point here is that if we're constantly learning from retrospective examination, that's how we get better. My concern, though, is what gets lost in the conversation is the DCAA, the Defense Contract Audit Agency, and the Department of Justice are not part of that conversation, and they are frequently looking for very specific technical violations that lead to fraud prosecutions and big recoveries. I also love the fact that Stuart mentioned the importance of contract administration. Let's be unequivocally clear, particularly if you're a pricing guru. A contract is the beginning of a relationship. Imagine if you lived your life going out there looking for a spouse, and the day of your wedding you declared victory and assumed it would be happily ever after. We know better. Marriages are relationships. They require work. And if you go back to the late 1980s and look at the quarter century of underinvestment in the acquisition workforce, we did the most damage with regard to post-award contract administration. And so all of these creative things we do on the front end, we need to marry them with expertise and staff on the back end, and we're not there yet. I also love the fact that Stuart mentioned data analytics. Personally, I think one of Frank Kendall's greatest legacies was the annual performance assessment reports, and I hope we'll see another one this summer. But over time, we need better and different data. We know how much we spend, but we don't know whether we got value or whether the end user was happy with what we got, and hopefully we'll get there. But before I turn to the questions, I also want to focus on the fact that basically everyone mentioned something related to human capital, people, the importance of knowledge, the importance of knowledge sharing. That human element is so important. I love that Soraya mentioned the focus on negotiation. Both Soraya and Stuart mentioned how important it is to understand how the private sector prices. And that's all about market research. And market research takes time. Stuart talked about all of those key decisions, like getting the right contract type. But that's an acquisition planning issue. And what's the one word that we hear more than anything else, particularly in the last week? Speed, 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 speed. Well, often the first thing that we lose when we go quickly is planning and market research and all of the things that lead to good business decisions. All right, let me suggest this. I'm going to start at the opposite end and then come back.
Can I jump in on something you just said? So we argue that we lose speed when we incorporate planning. I argue that that's not true. I believe that the better job you do up front, you make up time in the end. If you bring the team together and the team is coming through the process together, they're learning from each other, they're adapting, Where we lose time is when we don't do that upfront planning, have that conversation up front, and keep the right players involved, and then we're trying to bring them along at the end. That's what causes the most consternation. And I'm seeing that when we do incorporate better planning in our procurements, the lead time is actually shrunk. Because at the tail end, you're not spending a lot of time revisiting issues. So that would be my argument.
So I have a massive stack of questions. Let me offer a concatenation of what I would say are the most common questions in the stack, and I'm going to start with Janice and come back this way. The first group of questions are, what is the biggest challenge that you face, but more importantly, what are the challenges you face in terms of solving those challenges through individual people, or how do you share the knowledge, how do you train down, how do you get people on the same sheet of music? So that's one group of questions. And then the other, I can't tell you the number of questions I have on reducing transaction costs, streamlining the proposal and the negotiation timeline. What kind of innovations do you see to basically facilitate speeding up the process so that by the time the proposals are being prepared, people aren't behind the curve? And the interesting thing along those lines, a number of questions specifically talk to elaborate pricing templates and supporting documents. Some people want everybody to use ProPricer. Some people don't like the Excel. But how can you make it easier and more quickly? Those are pretty broad, and obviously anything else you want. But let's start with Janice.
Okay, so I think when it comes to challenges, the biggest challenge where I'm sitting is just getting the word out. So we do these great things. You might send out an email to the masses, and then you expect, hopefully, that everybody's received that message, and then they're, off and running. And so I think that's kind of the biggest challenge. And I think that what we're doing right now in the arena of pricing with respect to streamlining, it's really about cultural change. And that starts with the individual pricers and contracting officers. So one of the benefits in my current position is that we function as advisors to the majority of the Air Force when it comes to major weapon systems. And so I've got a group of folks that are out there helping these guys real time doing what they're doing. And then we're trying to take the results of that and then share it with the greater community so people can see, hey, this actually worked. And so I find that that is one of the biggest challenges. When it comes to where we're going as far as data and how we can do this business a lot faster when it comes to proposals, some of the discussion that I've had with Mr. Assad relates to the definition of cost and pricing data. And, we've had these, discussions in terms of, does it have to be an all or nothing proposition? Does certified, because it's the current, accurate, and complete. It's the complete part of it that I think, is what probably industry might struggle with the most in terms of everything. So then
and it's also where the prosecutions tend to find the most fertile material.
Exactly.
So, and I will admit, being the diehard pricer that I am, I don't have the level of sympathy for the idea of fraud, because if it's truly fraud, then we should be going after it. And to me, defective pricing is different than fraud. And I've resolved a lot of defective pricing cases in my time. And I can tell you the vast majority of them were not a situation where we thought a company was intentionally trying to cheat the government such that we need to, turn it over to, the IG or the Department of Justice. So getting back to the idea of, does certified cost or pricing data have to be an all or nothing, preposition? I think the answer is there's something in the middle, and it's really called actuals. And as we're doing these FMS pilots, we're looking at what is really most relevant. And it's been kind of interesting to think through, okay, what does a TINA cert, a certificate of current cost or pricing data, look like in that particular environment? But I think there's a way to reach in and get this relevant data, have the company certify to that. I think it dramatically reduces the burden on the company in terms of if that's the level of information that they're providing. Do I think they ought to keep that information current? You betcha. If the actuals are updated, I would expect that they could update them for us, but I don't know that they have to go out and create a whole bunch of new data to satisfy that particular proposition.
Stuart?
Well, challenge, it always comes down to communicate till there's no opportunity for miscommunication. And I think even in this time of fast tweets and messages that we're sending to each other, we still are not doing as well as we could in communicating across all of our Army commands that are working hard to support. So we're constantly working on that, and anything we do battle rhythms such as we still, say you must talk to the individual. Let's quit with the emails. Let's talk to them so you understand where's your difference. So that's something that we're working on. On the people aspect, I know the Honorable Ms. Lord is looking at with Defense Acquisition University and looking at what is called the Defense Acquisition Improvement Workforce Act, DAWIA, where we came up with our level 1, level 2s, level 3s. We know that possibly that should not be the prerequisite for placing a warrant on somebody. Or as I move now, I have with our use of under the authorities, whether it's OTAs for Section 845, which used to be there, but now we have a new one in 10 U.S.C. 2371B, which is allowing us to go to prototype. I'm seeing a whole new status of agreements officers. Agreements officers that have to know more than what a normal contracting officer would need to know, because they may be working from a clean sheet of paper. And if they're not thinking of everything from intellectual property all the way through, then we're going to miss the mark there. I think I heard Mr. Assad mention procurement administrative lead time, and that's very important to us. I fought procurement administrative lead time when we started speaking about it again, because I did not want it to drive the wrong behavior. Because many times it's about the requirements generation, the requirements lead time. Are we shaping the requirements well? And when you got a good requirements complete package, then as you turn into phase, the players don't change. They just take on different roles. Whereas that engineer that helped with now you might transition to where a contracting officer takes more of a lead role when it comes into the procurement administrative aspect of that. What we're doing right now with our data is that we're looking at procurement administrative lead time, not only by organization, down to what is that office, but what are they buying by category, because we know it's different in the cycle times. And then we're looking at it by dollar amount, because the policies that are out there today may drive us at different thresholds to a different behavior. And as you change dollar thresholds, then you start opening the aperture for different things. So collecting the poll data is very important to us by that means, because then we can zero in and we can see if someone's out of tolerance. If it normally takes us 170 days to award a particular type of commodity, and I know I have a buying activity that has all of a sudden taken 230 days, and I'm seeing that, I can now peel back to that office and say, let's look at this. Why are we having this? And maybe then we find out they didn't get the message that we have a new approach that could save them all kinds of time. Or I can find out they just had a turnover rate and that they had a lot of new contract specialists with less than 3 to 5 years experience that they were trying to get up. And then we can start looking at workload movement. So that particular metric now, in the era of the accessibility to data, takes a whole different meaning to me than what it did back in the 90s. And as we know, when we talk about how can we get there and streamline, I mean, I've been paperless since 1994, I think, or something. And I don't think I even had a computer until 1998. But we've got to get best to the point where we keep saying, I still got paper sent to me. I still got that. We need to do something so that we do take on the electronic data sharing, and that will help us. But there again, it depends as into where we can do this. But we need to get you good requirements. And if our intent, and we promise you a good requirements package that you can submit us a proposal on, then your commitment to us to submit us that proposal within 60 days goes a long way. And then we're always in the business. What's the consideration? You give me that proposal in 60 days and it's a good proposal, then I got to commit to you that in 60 days I'm going to do something. And then we're going to do something together. And if I had to say anything, what do I think that we're doing is a agreement between us and industry that we will work hard to get you good requirement packages. You work hard to get us those proposals. And then we start keeping track. And we've got to know accountability and responsibility. That if we come back and say, we gave you good requirements packages, but you still continue to take a longer period of time proposals, then we need to take some action in that as into who we're selecting or who we're doing business with.
Just leveraging off of kind of what Janice and Stuart said is that I think it is important is that we do come up with a lot of good ideas in that. So we come up with innovative ways to reduce transaction costs in that. And it's communicating that back out to the entire workforce. And I think that was always a piece of the puzzle is that how do you reach them out to get to everybody out there to let them know what's out there and what they have these tools and they have these things that they can do and that it's okay. It's been blessed, so to speak, by the headquarters and that and says you can do this and that. And so we have been tackling that a little bit. One of the innovative, I don't know if it's innovative or not, but it was that we brought on a knowledge management officer that sits on the headquarters procurement staff. And that's their thing. Come up with ways that we can reach out to everybody, nowadays. And that, because a lot of things is that, I'm an older guy, all right? And so kind of adjust to the new ways and all the social media and that. But a lot of times what I'm thinking is that the way I want to put the message out is not the way that some of our workforce wants to receive that message. And that's where we're coming through with the knowledge management officer is that reaching out, trying to get those folks that are down there that are our interns or the new contracting officers and that and say, hey, what do you think? How would you like to see this? And trying to revamp those websites that'll meet their needs in that. I mentioned about the collaboration sites. That's one of those things that they want to go to a website. They can see something that they have there, can instantaneously ask a question if there's one there. And then we have to have the ability to have somebody that can timely respond back to that question, on those things. And trying to set up, those ways to communicate out to the folks in that. We're trying to do webinars. Not everything's going to be a training class all the time. We always tend to default to this, let's do a training class, another 2-day training class. We're trying to set up everything and do that. We're trying to look at this to where we can do webinars, find these hot topics, things that we want to get out, the messages we want to get out to folks in that, and create these 15-minute, 30-minute videos that we can put up on the site that people can come hit when they have time and look at that and say, oh, yeah, that's what they said. Okay, now I get it. Or at least it prompts them to ask more questions and to come up and ask more details about that. So I think that's very important is that trying to reach out to all those folks. It's one of our bigger challenges to make sure that everybody knows all the tools that they have at their disposal in order to reduce transaction costs, streamline the process, and do those improvements like Stuart and Janice were talking about in that. The other thing I want to pull on is that what Janice says, cost and pricing data. Okay, going out there, we have procurements in that. We talk about the cultures in that. Sometimes we ask for too much. The contractors have their proposal in their estimating system. We check that. They generate proposals in that. And then we've been finding out within NASA is that sometimes we just kind of get carried away in the solicitation and we attach to the solicitation and say, yeah, that's great, but we want you to fill out this spreadsheet too. And oh, by the way, fill out this spreadsheet and this spreadsheet and that spreadsheet. And that's driving up our cost. That's driving up the B&P cost in that. And so we're kind of taking a look at that, peeling back and said, do you really need to have them fill out all those Excel spreadsheets? Isn't what they're supplying right out of their system good enough in that? And it's a culture change. I'll tell you, people are married to that. They said, well, it worked before. I loved it. It worked on this last procurement, so I want to do it again on this next procurement. Or so-and-so did on the procurement, and it worked for them, so let me try it on this procurement, Now, let's take a look at what you have, the requirements you have here, and let's see if we can reduce down to just that cost data that we need. And that's just one thing that's just going to take time. It's going to take time to change that culture, to get people comfortable and say, you really don't need that. We can wean you off of that little Excel spreadsheet that you're getting. You've got the information in this proposal to do the job you need. So those are a few of the things, some of the challenges and things we're working on.
So the nice thing about being the last one on the list is you can say ditto, ditto, ditto. No, just kidding. But I agree with everything that my colleagues are talking about. I would say I think the largest challenge is how we share information. I have to agree with Bill, is trying to find ways to get the information out to our workforce, the training, the knowledge, and the sharing of best practices and lessons learned across our workforce, especially when we're very geographically dispersed as we are at DHS, where I have a workforce of roughly 1,400 procurement professionals that are spread out across the country, and some in very remote locations. The other challenge is not just the procurement workforce. We need to be sharing this information across the acquisition community, the program managers, the pricing analysts, the cost analysts that sit in the finance shops, the IT folks. It really is about sharing across the community. So some of the things that we've done through our Homeland Security Acquisition Institute is, of course, we have the formal institutionalized training to get you certified, and we work with FAI and DAU and other organizations to bring that training. But we've also tried to structure is a lot of what I call just-in-time webinars and training sessions, on-the-spot training, that 1-hour training session that tells you what you need to know about a particular aspect of what you're doing, so that the contracting officer has at their disposal that quick hit training that they can take at their desktop, whether they're clicking on a webinar or they're just clicking on a little tip sheet that tells them what to do. The point is to get tools in their hands that refreshes their memory, because one of the things that we forget is not every contracting officer does everything every day. And so they may forget some things. They may not be as brushed up on what the latest techniques are. The other thing that we're doing is things like these agreements, like the OTAs and other agreements that are popping up. We provide very specialized training for that. And sometimes that training is mandatory for those individuals that are going to work on those actions. And we actually modify their warrants to say that they're trained on those actions, because I think it is important to make sure that our folks understand how to use tools like the OTAs. We have created agreements and a couple of intermediary partnership agreements, or I think I said that backwards. But anyway, we have the alphabet soup of agreements out there, and we want to make sure that the folks that are entering into those agreements really understand how to use the agreements, when to use them, and how to engage with industry when they're talking about these agreements. And so we provide very tailored and specialized training in those areas and webinars on lessons learned. And here's the thing that we do with webinars that's a little bit different, maybe, hopefully, than some of the other folks are doing. We bring in the teams that are the experts in doing this. We bring the folks in that have tried new innovative approaches or new techniques, and we let them provide that webinar. We let them talk to their peers and share their learning. And we do this through facilitated discussions. We find that that creates a better learning experience because you're hearing from people who really have done this, who really have touched it, who live in our world and understand what some of the challenges are. The other thing that I did want to talk a little bit about is innovation. So I stood up what's called the Procurement Innovation Lab, and the whole idea behind that was to invite the procurement workforce and our program management workforce to identify ways that we can improve our business processes and hopefully streamline the procurement process. Now, when I say procurement, the streamlining, I'm not talking about just doing it fast. I'm saying do it more effectively, more efficiently. So one of the things that we're doing is focusing on a testing approach where people bring us an innovation and they work that innovation on their particular procurement, and we're just kind of monitoring it as we go along and interviewing folks along the way to see how that experience is going. And then we train on that innovation. Whether or not that innovation worked, we take the lessons learned if it didn't work, but if it worked really well, we try to share that best practice across our community. In fact, we just recently published, literally this week, our Procurement Innovation Lab report that shows some of the techniques we're trying. But that leads me to PALT. I am a firm believer in PALT. I think PALT helps us understand what it takes to do the job, hopefully to get it done right, and what the expectations are that we can set for the customers that we serve, for the people that we support. But I think it is important to measure PALT from a variety of angles. I agree with Stuart. You measure based on the contract type, the requirement, the program offices, the commodities you're buying. But I think there's another thing that you got to measure PALT on, and that is the phase of the procurement. I think it is extremely important to understand what it takes at each phase, because the more you know about a commodity, the quicker you can probably get your solicitation out there. The less you know about a commodity, the more research you're going to have to do. And maybe you are going to have to work with industry to help build that requirement. Because sometimes we think we know about a commodity or a service, but we really don't understand it. So I think it's extremely important to, again, that engagement with industry as early as possible. I am a diehard believer in planning to help build that requirement and help build the right procurement strategy, the right acquisition strategy as we go forward. And it doesn't mean you're going to plan to death on every single procurement, but it does mean that you're going to bring your team together and talk about all the different areas. And then the last thought that I leave you with is that I often get very uncomfortable when folks want to give us and take away tools. I think you give us the tools, let us put them in the toolbox so that we can pull them out and use them as we need them. So whether it's LPTA, OTAs, PIAs, CRADAs, and I can go down the alphabet soup, or the variety of contract types or some combination of those contract types, we need to just decide what are those four corners that we need to work in, and then put all those tools in the toolbox. Help our folks understand how to use those tools, when to use those tools, and empower them to use those tools. And stop trying to dictate that LPTA fits over here, it doesn't fit there, that you should use this kind of contract for this or this contract for that. I think we got to leave some to the creativity of our folks. If not, we're wasting a lot of talent and a lot of energy out there. So those are my points.
All right. Well, I think that all of our panelists seem to agree that one of the most challenging issues in this particular field is getting the word out. I love the fact that Janice specifically mentioned the importance of cultural change. As we know, communicating and teaching rules and processes is easy, but communicating policy and changing behavior is incredibly hard. So the challenge to all of us is to keep working together to keep at it. I also really appreciate the fact that Bill mentioned the issue of bid and proposal costs. We all grew up in a culture where the default position, the easier thing to do for the CO is to just ask for everything. When in doubt, you ask for too much. It's a lose-lose outcome. It's a bad habit and a bad practice. And if we can think more creatively about only asking for what we need, and then the larger question of can we rethink the certification to kind of correlate with asking for less, I think that's the one thing that the various changes to TINA and the FAR never really anticipated. I had two interesting things that I just want to mention based on some questions. I'm looking at the time, we're almost done. There were questions, and Shay spoke earlier about the increase in the threshold on the TINA, the 750,000 to 2 million. And I have to say, it seems to me that the focus on that is probably much ado about nothing. This is not much different than what we've done over time, raising the micro-purchase threshold. It's all about transaction costs. Is it worth the candle? Are we getting return on investment by getting staggering amounts of information on lower-level transactions? But I do think that we don't have good data on the return on investment, and we also don't know the mix between prime contractors and subcontractors, which makes it a little bit more complicated. The other thing is there were some questions on how all of this impacts small business, and I'm kind of curious, frankly, as to how significant that is, particularly given the thresholds and some of the coverage. But I do think that most people think there should be a double standard, and then, of course, they ask, is that appropriate or not, and how does that all play out? But in a couple minutes left, any last words, Janice?
No.
Alex, that's efficient. Stuart?
I would just say, on the small business, I think to leave with is that we're committed to small businesses, and I do not believe, a lot of the changes that we're talking about may be affecting primes and major defense acquisition programs, so that we've got to look at then that subcontractor piece that you may be filling in a subcontractor role. And I think that we do have an eye on that, but for the other regards of it, I think we will continue to keep doing billions of dollars worth of business with the small business industry. Thank you.
Bill?
I'll just pull on what you said, Soraya. The last thing, the kind of point you made is that I think it's very important that we don't start dictating solutions to those CEOs, and that I wholeheartedly agree with you. I'd love to talk to you more about that afterwards, is that let's give them the tools in the toolbox, train them to make smart business decisions and to do that analysis, and let them make the right decision. I don't like it when I see things coming out that we're sitting there and dictating to them and saying, you shall do this, you shall use this contract, you shall do this. because I think that's just taken away, all that talent, like you said, that's out there for them to make the best business decision for the government and to save costs by making that good decision.
So my final thought is that I think we do need to promote creativity and innovation in our workforce. We need to encourage them to take some calculated risks, to try new things. But again, I'm passionate about our workforce. I'm passionate about what we do. And at the end of the day, this is all about serving the missions that we each support, that our organizations support. So I encourage everyone to continue this lifelong learning, as I like to call it, but go out there and encourage each other to really be innovative and creative and find better ways to do it. I think it's feasible and I think it's possible.
And on that uplifting note, let me just reinforce that whether you're out there working in the government, whether you're working in the private sector, whether you've gone back and forth from one for the other, let's just remember, this field is complicated, it's tough, and most days the job is thankless and underappreciated. So on behalf of all of the people that should say it more often, thank you for your commitment, thank you for your efforts, thank you for your service. Please join me in thanking the panelists.
Thank you. Thanks. Good job.